Hi lovebugs, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid. It just came out this month or last month and it's been getting pretty divisive reviews. I think there's basically people who love it and people who hate it, and I gave the book 2 stars, so just keep that in mind for this review. If that's going to be a problem for you, maybe watch a different video. I think that maybe one of the reasons for this discrepancy though is just that it is a Shakespeare retelling, and so there's going to be people who really love the Shakespeare and really wanted it to be very accurate to the Shakespeare, and there's going to be people who didn't read the Shakespeare or don't care about the Shakespeare or don't care about the accuracy. Because I made the potentially fatal mistake of rereading Macbeth before reading this book in preparation, because it's been a few years and I just wanted to refresh my memory, and I think that that was really detrimental to my enjoyment of this story, because I mean, at points it is unrecognizable. Like, it is really a very loose retelling. It's not even really a retelling. She calls it a reimagining, and I think that even that is like, it's very loose at times. I think that I would have enjoyed this book a lot better if somebody had told me beforehand, don't treat it like a Shakespeare retelling, treat it like an original new fantasy series, and you'll enjoy it a lot more. So that is my advice to you, is that if you want to read this book after this video, treat it like it's its own animal. Treat it like it's something completely different, and you will like it much more. The prose is good. The atmosphere is good. I thought the vibes were there. And I haven't read a whole lot of fiction that takes place in this time period. So of course the Shakespearean Macbeth is based on a historical Macbeth who lived in like the 1050s, I think. And so that's the time period that the book is taking place in. And I don't really know a whole lot about that time period, but it is very linguistically and culturally diverse in North Europe at that time, and we saw a lot of that, like the differences between different cultures and just like language barriers. I thought that was interesting. I of course don't know if it is an accurate portrayal of that time because I don't know shit, but I thought that that was interesting. It's a nice break from the very the vaguely European 14th 15th century medieval fiction, like fantasy vibe that most fantasy books go for. As I want to frame this video really just talking about this book as an examination of Lady Macbeth's character in the book, and also just kind of a broader conversation about feminist retellings. This video is going to be a little bit rambly and maybe a little bit ranty because I have like points that I want to hit, but I haven't written anything out, and also I'm trying to talk fast before my roommates come home, so just bear with me. The blurb states that this book gives Shakespeare's famous villainess Lady Macbeth a voice and power, and I think that that should have been a red flag for me immediately, because Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth is not voiceless. Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth speaks her, like, Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth is a powerful character in her own right. She speaks out. She's has this like powerful will. She's extremely ambitious. She drives the plot of the story. She has agency within the story, and the way that she speaks very often is gendered. Like, she speaks in a lot of gendered language throughout the entire play, about herself, about her husband, about the situation. Like, she speaks in gendered terms that would lend themselves to a really interesting like feminist reimagining, feminist analysis of this play, because she talks about feeling constrained in her gender. She talks about wanting to act outside of what is appropriate of her gender, wanting to push against the boundary of like what is allowed for women of her time. So it's very clear that like she is aware of her role as a woman in society. She's aware of what is deemed good and bad for women, and she is still pushing against that. She is knowingly pushing against the female role at the time. That makes for such a much more interesting and dynamic character than what we get in Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid. Like, I think that the original Shakespearean Lady Macbeth is so interesting because of how aware she is and because of how clear she is, how ambitious she is. What we get with Lady Macbeth in Ava Reid's version is that she is a 17-year-old French girl whose eyes cause madness in men. The real historical Lady Macbeth was a Scottish woman named Gruch, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that somewhat right because every website I looked at gave me a different pronunciation. But she was potentially around 17 when she married the real Macbeth. And so I don't really have an issue with this aging down of the character because it is historical. It does vastly change the character's dynamic and her dynamic, like in her relationship with Macbeth. So I do think that like it is a choice to do this. Shakespeare's Macbeth is clearly an older woman, a woman who is more established in herself. And so the decision to go historical in this regard, but not in other regards, I think is a little bit strange, but I'm also not extremely opposed to it because there is like, you know, there is a historical justification for it. But the way that the character behaves is unrecognizable to Shakespeare's Macbeth. And again, like the back of the book is invoking Shakespeare's Macbeth, not the historical Macbeth. And Shakespeare's not a historian. Like his historical plays are not great. Not great in terms of history. But the way that she interacts with her husband, the way that she speaks is completely unlike anything that Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth would do. And we'll come back to that in a second. But first of all, the way that Macbeth is portrayed, he's this like enormous, hulking, huge man. Every time she sees him, every time he appears on the page, we get some kind of description of how large this guy is. She sees him in a crowd and she's like, he's the biggest guy here. He's just like heads above everybody else. Even though they're all big warrior men, he's so big. And so we are getting also on Macbeth's side this really like reductive characterization where he's being made into this kind of one note, huge violent man, this like perpetrator of the patriarchy, this like perfect representation of patriarchy himself. You know, he's like this symbolic, almost just like caricature, like what's the word that I'm looking for, archetype of like the warrior man. He's so big, he's so violent, he's kind of mean. And the way that she kind of handles this in the book is that whenever he's like talking to her and she's hiding something from him, she'll be like, I'm only a woman, I don't know anything, I'm only a woman. And I understand where this is going, like in terms of the feminist commentary in it, is it's like hiding behind the social norms that men have constructed in order to like push against those norms in a way, because she is concealing something about herself that he would not approve of by hiding behind patriarchal views. But that is not at all the woman that Lady Macbeth is in Shakespeare's Macbeth, because Lady Macbeth in Shakespeare hears that her husband doesn't want to kill a man, the king, who he respects and cares about. She hears that he doesn't want to kill that guy, and she says, are you a man? Are you a man? Are you a man? Because if you're not a pussy, you will go kill that. That's what she would have said if Shakespeare wasn't censored. I don't know if they said that back in his time, but she would have if he had the option. And I think that, I mean, it's, again, like, it's okay. It's fine. If this was completely removed from Shakespeare's Macbeth, I wouldn't mind it, but the book, like, specifically says that it's retelling Shakespeare. Like, specifically is retelling Shakespeare, is reimagining Shakespeare. And so this character being completely unrecognizable from the one that we expect is weird. And I'm actually going to spoil it for you now because I feel like it's gonna cause confusion if I don't do this now. The real Lady Macbeth, Gruch, is in the book, and it is not Rasil, who is our main character. But she will come back to. So just something to keep in mind is that Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth and historical Lady Macbeth are in the book, but they are not the titular Lady Macbeth of the story. I think that one of the most crucial plot elements of Macbeth is when Lady Macbeth convinces Macbeth to kill the king. Because, like, I mean, again, with the gendered language, she said, are you a man? She says, unsex me, like, make me more manly. So she hears, in, like, the first scene that we see her, she hears word of this prophecy. She hasn't even seen Macbeth yet, and she's like, oh, I know he's not going to be a man enough to do this, so I'm going to have to push him to do it. And that's exactly how it plays out. And again, she's using these very gendered terms, very gendered language to discuss this thing that's happening around her. And it is interesting, and it could really lend itself to some really interesting storytelling, and just like really diving deep into her character and the understanding of women at the time and all that. But what happens in this book is that he convinces her to go kill the king, and then she goes and she enchants the guards with her magic eyes to make them do it for her. And it just is this thing where this agency that the original character had, when the agency that Shakespeare's Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, had, is no longer present. Like, we've already, in a story that claims to be giving Lady Macbeth a voice, you've taken her voice, like, you've completely removed any agency that the character had. And also, many times throughout the story, she's described as, like, being clever. She's a clever girl, she's his clever wife. No plot that she ever enacts at any point seems like it is going to work or goes well for her. Like, nothing about her, call me crazy, but I think that characters should prove themselves to be clever before we call them clever. But anyway, that's just a note for myself. But this is just kind of an issue that I've been noticing in a lot of these feminist retellings, is that the characters are rewritten in such a way that removes all the agency and voice that they did have in the story that is being retold. And because, you know, a lot of these female characters at the time that they were written, they were vocal. Lady Macbeth was vocal. Lady Macbeth is not a silent woman who has been sidelined by history. She is a woman who had ambition and willpower and all of these things, and like, to remove that in this new retelling doesn't make sense to me. But then also at the same time, in a lot of these retellings, we see an increase of the violence towards women that does not exist in the story that is being retold in the original or the older version of the story. And we see that in, like, Circe. Even though I have a lot of respect for Madeline Miller, she's an MA in classics, like, she's much more qualified than a lot of people to be writing these kinds of stories. In Circe, one of the motives for her turning the men into pigs is that she is violated by Odysseus's men, when that is not the case in mythology. She's just kind of does that to people because she likes to, because she's a goddess. Why shouldn't she? We see it in Lilith also, which I didn't finish for many reasons, but she is violated in the Garden of Eden, when that does not happen in the Tanakh. And we see it in this book, where Lady Macbeth is violated by Macbeth, which does not happen in the original Shakespeare. And I don't feel the need to speculate about whether or not it happened to the historical Lady Macbeth, because I don't really think that's appropriate. Obviously, it's possible. Obviously, like, it was another time and these things exist, but if it doesn't exist in the Shakespeare, I don't see why you are changing the story to such a degree that you have to include it. Like, because that's your choice at this point, because Shakespeare already gave us a version where Lady Macbeth has a voice and where this does not happen to her. So to choose to change those things, I think is a little bit strange. And also, you are the one invoking Shakespeare's name on the back of the book, not history. Like, anyway, it's just, it doesn't strike me as feminist to increase the suffering of women while decreasing their agency in order to make very bland, simple points about feminism that could have been made in another way. Because the feminism in these books is never, like, that deep. And also, just in a storytelling sense, the effect of removing Lady Macbeth's agency in this scene where she convinces her husband to kill this guy is that now one of the central struggles that she goes through, which is her guilt, does not feel as powerful. That Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth has this, like, really interesting arc where she's feeling this guilt of, like, what she's done. And Ava Reid's Lady Macbeth, it's, like, not her fault. She's only acting in response to the men around her. She's not acting of her own accord. It doesn't come from her. It comes from the men around her. Her actions really are being defined by the men in her life. She's responsive. She's defensive. She's not acting for her own ambitions. And it makes it more difficult to handle that, like, to take really seriously that guilt that she feels afterwards, because it's like, it's so easy to just be like, oh, well, it was her husband's fault. You know, he's the one who told her, who made her do it. He's the one who put her in this position. He's such a large, violent man. He's such a warmonger. He's such a bad person. And she's just, like, trying to make a way in this world as a woman. You know, she's so constrained by her role, by her... You see what I like? It's so easy to be like, oh, well, it's not her fault. She didn't actually do this bad thing. It's his fault. When I think that it's so rich in Shakespeare's Macbeth to see the aftermath of the murder that they do, like to see the fallout after what happens, to see the characters like throughout the rest, like the second half of the play, really just like devolving. It's so interesting, and it would have been really interesting because we don't see a whole lot of Lady Macbeth in like the second half of Shakespeare's Macbeth. It would have been really interesting to see like a character study kind of thing into just like how this happens to her, to see her ambition and her pushing against gender roles and realizing that her ambition has outmatched her moral compass, really. But I think that that is also something that we see in a lot of these feminist retellings, is that the women can never just do something bad. You know, the women can never just be bad. If a female character does something bad, does something evil, it's in response to something that a man has already done. Women in these stories aren't allowed to have the same moral complexity as the men characters are allowed to have. And like we see Jason and Theseus and Heracles, and they're allowed to do bad things. Even like Odysseus and Achilles, who get really whitewashed in a lot of these retellings anyway, they're allowed to make mistakes. They're allowed to do bad things. And the women are only allowed to do it if a man has already done something wrong to them first. And I do recognize that some of this definitely comes from the idea that these female characters are vilified in the past because they are women who don't fit societal standards. So women like Lady Macbeth, who are acting outside of the confines of what is appropriate for women of the time. That is easy to vilify because like she's acting out. And women like Cersei, this like trope of the reclusive witch, is rooted in this like sexist idea that women who do not conform to society are inherently dangerous, are inherently evil. But I don't think that the solution to that issue in history, to that sexist trope, is to completely strip them of their agency and impose additional suffering onto them in order to justify what amount of bad things they do. At some point, you are reducing women to this also sexist idea that women are these like pure, innocent creatures who can only do wrong if something external happens to them first. It's this idea that women need external corruption in order to reach the same moral complexity that men are born with. The agency removal and violence amplification dynamic is also seen in the witches in Lady Macbeth, because in Lady Macbeth, they are being kept prisoner under Macbeth's castle, and he goes to them for prophecies, and they tell him the prophecies. And I mean, I do. So we find out at the very end of the book, this is gonna be spoilers, sorry guys. At the very end of the book, we find out that one of these women is Gruch, is the original Lady Macbeth, the first wife. And so we have this idea that Macbeth is keeping all the women that he's wronged in his life and continuing to exploit them even after they have been completely ruined, even after he has completely ruined their lives. And again, I do like the idea, this like Bluebeard's wives thing, but he's actually like continuing to return to them and continuing to take something from them even after he has destroyed them. I think that's really powerful. I think that's really good. But I don't think it works in a Macbeth retelling because it does come at the expense of all the agency that the original Shakespearean Lady Macbeth had. I think this book could have been a really interesting continuation of the gendered language and like gender discussion that Lady Macbeth does bring up in Shakespeare, but with the benefit of hindsight and of hundreds of years of feminist works and feminist theory and, you know, just development of women's role in society in order to like inform the commentary that's going on. I think that could have been so interesting, and I'm so disappointed in this. I was so excited for this book, and it really let me down in a lot of ways. But I again, like, I do think that the witches thing would work in a different book. I just don't know that it works in this one because it removes the agency that did exist in the original work, and because it enforces more violence onto the women where it did not exist in the original book. It's this really weird duality where like we're stripping the voice from the women and putting more violence onto them while claiming to empower them. And I don't think that's empowering. I don't think that's making the statement that you think it is. I'm getting really worked up, so I'm not making a whole lot of sense, but I don't think that's empowering. And also I want to talk briefly about the relationship between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth in this version, because it's obviously, like, as I've said, it is abusive. There is sexual violence that happens within it. And that does not exist in Shakespeare's Macbeth. And again, it's not my place to speculate about whether or not it happened to the real life woman who has been dead for 1,000 years. May she rest. Like, I will let her rest. But in Shakespeare's Macbeth, the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth is positive, is loving. They have a real relationship, like a real romantic marriage between them. And there's this idea in Shakespeare, when we talk about Shakespeare, that Shakespeare doesn't have any subtext. And people like to argue about whether or not that is completely true or not, but what we can take away from it is that, generally speaking, typically in Shakespeare, the characters say what they mean. When characters are lying, when they're not saying what they mean, they tell you first. So characters like Iago in Othello, who is constantly lying, and he tells us that he's going to be doing that. We, the audience, know beforehand that he's lying. We know while he's lying. We know why he's lying. We know to what ends he is lying. It isn't subtext. We know explicitly because he told us. And so when characters like Macbeth say that they love Lady Macbeth, when they call Lady Macbeth my dearest love, my love, that is coming from a place of truth. That is coming from a place of genuineness. Like, that is real. We are meant to interpret that as being genuine. And I do think that whenever, in a lot of these retellings, there is this like motion to make every single male-female relationship in the work that is being rewritten negative, where it was once positive. And if the story that is being retold portrays this relationship as being a lot more equal than the modern retelling does, even if it does portray romance, even if it does portray some kind of respect between the two characters. And so, like, reducing that, removing that, again, is a removal of agency and an amplification of violence towards women. And I don't like it. It's not progressive, it's not historical, it's not helpful, it's not true. I have a little bit of a historical tangent to support myself with that, because I, a few semesters ago, read Xenophon's Anabasis, which is a military autobiography by this guy named Xenophon when he was a Greek warrior. He was going over to like the Syria area to fight in a war. It didn't go well. He and his guys are retreating back to Greece. And so there's this point where he and the other soldiers stop two guys on the street, or, you know, the path, whatever. It wasn't a paved road, but, you know, they ask one of the guys, can we take this route through the mountains to get back to mainland Greece? And this guy says, no, you're fucked. That's it. You're gonna die here. And so they kill him, and then they ask the second guy if the same question, if they can do that, and he says, yes, he just didn't want to tell you because his daughter lives there. And this happens in probably 2 lines of the book, but I think it is so powerful to see this random man who does not get a name, who we get no follow-up on, his daughter, anything, was willing to die for his kid because he loved her, that knowing that she would never hear about it, knowing that she would never know what happened to him, and that she would never have that kind of closure. He was willing to die for the chance to keep her safe. He was willing to protect her in that way, knowing what they would do to him. People can exist within a patriarchal structure, within, you know, extreme gender roles and extremely rigid ideas of masculinity and femininity, and still have individual relationships within that. We are complex enough human beings to exist within that society and still have individual interpersonal relationships. It is possible, because if it was possible for this one random dad in ancient fucking Greece, how many other men have done, how many other fathers have died for their daughters, how many other brothers and husbands and love, like how many other people, how many other women have died to keep men safe, how many other mothers and sisters, like how many other human beings have loved each other enough despite the systems that we live within. I did a really bad job of explaining myself the first time, so I'm gonna give it another go. But basically what I mean is that whenever you remove the love between men and women, the very positive relationships that do exist between men and women in the original stories, you are removing agency in some way, because the relationships that you have to people impact your social standing, impact your ability to affect other people's actions. And so that is agency in a way. And it also is an imposition of additional violence onto women, because it's removing all positive aspects of their life. It's really reducing male-female relationships to this very simplistic one-note version where there can only ever be abuse and terrible power dynamic. And the thing is that if you look within even the oldest stories that we have, even if we look at the Iliad, opens on a father trying to rescue his daughter. That is the opening scene. And so if we really do look, we will find that throughout history, throughout time, women have experienced love. Women have had positive relationships. Perseus, in the original myth, is fighting Medusa in an effort to save his mom. We have Penelope and Telemachus, who have a very positive relationship. We have all these women throughout history who have been loved and who have experienced positive relationships with men. And so to remove that, I think, is a disservice to them and is a disservice to the very complex situation where they are able to have positive interpersonal relationships, positive singular relationships with men, despite existing in a much broader context of patriarchal gender hierarchy, of these extremely rigid gender norms. So it is so much more interesting to see how those interpersonal relationships, how those individual relationships between individual men and individual women come into play in this larger construction of gender dynamic. It's so much more interesting to actually see that versus just to see every single male-female relationship being portrayed as this reflection of society's gender dynamics, if that makes sense. Because in this book, and in a lot of these, I think, the way that the male characters and female characters are written is, in a way, intended to be a reflection of just gender dynamics in general. So Macbeth is both himself, but he's also just an illustration of how every man in that society interacts with women. And Rasi is both herself, but also just the way that every woman is forced to act in their, they are both themselves and they are representative of their gender at the time. So they are individuals, but they're also symbolic of the relationships between men and women, is my understanding of why these relationships are changed in the modern retellings. But what that does is that it creates this very simplistic approach that only has one way of viewing male-female relationships, and that is really just reiterating this very simple, like very basic a criticism of patriarchy that we could have gotten anyway and still had a more complex relationship between the characters. Like, we lose so much characterization, we lose so much just nuance in the way that gender versus like personhood is understood in these stories whenever you reduce these characters to such archetypal versions of men and women, and in the sense that they are being representative of their gender, being representative and like primarily defined by their role as either man or woman in society. And on a just more emotional note, I think that whenever you take away the love from these stories and you replace that with this antagonism and abuse, I think that is a harm to the women of the time period who were living through this, like to the women who still had to make the best of their lives despite, you know, what was going on. I think that it is a harm that you are enforcing onto women, and I think it's a harm that you're enforcing onto modern women, because you're kind of in a way like presenting this image that like, oh, sexism was so bad back then, everything was so bad for women back then, instead of taking a more I don't know how to say this, like a more microscopic, detailed approach of like actually looking at individual relationships and actually looking at how those relationships can coexist even if they contradict the system of gender oppression. A lot of the times also these female characters are written with these very modern mindsets. They're written as if they are just like 21st century girls who were forced to live in this time period, but they have like the same understanding of gender and the same understanding of their own like freedoms and independences and what they are being robbed of by patriarchy that a modern woman would have. So they come into with this, I see it described as like this girl boss feminism, where they have a very 21st century approach. The criticism would be, I think, a lot stronger if it did have a better understanding of gender roles at the time and was able to portray those accurately and was able to portray how the characters are still able to push against those gender roles, even though they understand, like as Lady Macbeth does. And again,
Shakespeare is not like a feminist writer. Lady Macbeth is not a feminist character. And I worry that, like, because I'm praising her so much, because I'm talking so much about how the Shakespeare version is written better, like, you're gonna be like, oh, this play must be so progressive. It's not. It's really not. But comparatively, I think they also just lose a lot of the power of like what it means for these women in these time periods to be stepping against the gender roles of the time, to be acting out against that, because they are being portrayed in very much like they seem much more modern than the rest of the characters. And so for them to act with agency, for them to act with their own ambitions and with their own intention, comes across a lot less strong than if it was actually a woman who had a much clearer understanding of gender roles at the time that the story takes place. So it doesn't feel as much of a bravery. It doesn't feel so impactful. It doesn't feel so empowering. It doesn't feel so even just like socially deviant in order for them to be acting outside of gender roles, because they don't feel like they exist within the gender roles of the story. Like, they don't feel like they exist within the context of the story. They feel like they are from another time period, a much more recent time period, transplanted into this time period. And so of course they're acting more modern than everybody else. And so that makes it feel so much less like it is something revolutionary. Like, it is something, not at all that Shakespeare's Macbeth is revolutionary. Not at all that any of the like women of Greek mythology are revolutionary, but it feels less. It feels less. It feels less. I don't know. It just feels less strong. I don't know. What is so impressive about many of these women in the retelling phenomenon is the way that they are portrayed in the context of their time period. You know, we see them acting as individuals and acting with an amount of agency, even if it is restrained because of the time period. We do see them like within the context of the history of the time, like within their time period. Many of them are really impressive in how much agency that they have, are really interesting in how they are pushing against the constraints of their time period. And so whenever you modernize that to such a degree that the character feels modern and the setting still feels like a very poorly developed like idea of what ancient Greece looks like, or idea of whatever these settings are, it just doesn't have the same impact. I don't know that made much more sense than what I said originally, so.
But I guess, like, overall, I just think that it is such a disservice to the original characters who were so much more interesting. And again, like, I think that all these things could work if it wasn't banking on this Shakespeare reimagining as like being its premise, you know? This could work in a different story. If this was a different story, I really wouldn't have the same issues with it. But because you are explicitly comparing yourself to Shakespeare, like, I'm going to compare you to Shakespeare. Anyway, there is a longer conversation to be had about feminist retellings, like as a subgenre, that have been coming out a lot recently. I feel like maybe there's some fatigue towards them that is developing. I posted a TikTok recently about this phenomenon, and it's been getting a lot of like agreement, a lot of response, and so I feel like maybe we're just starting to strain towards it, because one of the big things is really just that it feels like this book is being marketed as like feminist and progressive as a marketing ploy, like as a way of getting people to pick up the book. It doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a place of actually wanting to talk about the story that it's being retold, or B, talk about feminism. It doesn't feel like the author really, like, with a lot of these, and not like specific to Lady Macbeth anymore, with a lot of these it feels like the author doesn't really have any respect or like have a whole lot of care for the story that they are retelling, or feminism. So it's like we're combining both in this very like marketable way, in this very this very just like surface level way so that we can appeal to an audience, and so that we can call it we can put it on all the like feminist book recommendation lists and like feminist literature, feminist retelling books that you should read. And it's the market is getting saturated so fast. I feel like every month I see a new feminist retelling. It's always, they always look the same, and I know that's just like in publishing, like the publishing industry. It's not the fault of the author. It gets to the point that it really feels like a cash grab. I think the one that like really the breaking point for me was seeing Jennifer Saint's Hera book came out. I got like an Instagram ad for it, and I was like, this is a cash grab, you know? Like at some point it feels like a cash grab, and that's nothing against Jennifer Saint. I truly don't have an opinion of the woman. I don't know enough about her to develop an opinion of the woman, but it's when you see so many things that look the exact same and sound the exact same and have the exact same bland, boring take on feminism while marketing themselves as being like so progressive that it becomes tiring. I'm fatigued looking at the fucking cover of Hera by Jennifer Saint. I don't want it. I'm not in it, okay? It just feels like these books are never as feminist as they want you to think they are, because they're not actually putting the work into like developing a take on the story, you know? They're not actually putting the work into developing a feminist critique of the story, or developing any kind of feminist reimagining of the story, or really just developing the story at all. You're being sold on the idea of this like old story being retold from a woman's perspective and it being so feminist, and then you open the book and the author hasn't actually done any of the work into feminism or the story that they're telling. And it's just frustrating sometimes. And obviously this doesn't apply to every single feminist retelling. There are good ones out there. There are ones that are exceptions to this, and you know, that I'm sure are great, but it's just difficult to even want to pick up one of these again when it's like I've seen it so many times. It feels like they're all the same and they're not doing anything new, you know? It doesn't feel original anymore. It doesn't feel anything. Some other like little notes for this book. There is some like anti-Scottish rhetoric in it, and I know that most of that is just because the character is French, and which is also a choice because like, okay, well, before we get to that, which is also a choice because the original Lady Macbeth was Scottish and Shakespeare's Macbeth was Scottish, so making her not Scottish and then have prejudice towards Scottish people, that's a little bit interesting. But yeah, there is some like anti-Scottish rhetoric throughout the book, because she's French and she has opinions, and like some of that can be explained by narrator bias, but also everything that the Scottish men do in the story completely affirms what she thinks about them. And she says pretty like loaded things about them. She calls them like barbaric. She says savage, words that I would never use to describe like really loaded language. And then the way that they act, it's kind of like, I mean, that's not the word I would have used, but I see where you're coming from, girl. Like, and then the one man who is decent and who our love interest for the story, he's like the one guy who's kind to her and who isn't a pig, is half English. So he isn't even fully Scottish. So it's like, you know, on the one hand, I think that you can excuse a lot of the anti-Scottish language in the book as being from the narrator's bias, but then you also have to think about, why does the narrator have a bias? Because it was also like the author's choice to make her French in the first place. Also, why are the men affirming that bias through their action? Like, the story does nothing to show us that her bias is different from the way that the men act. Everything they do is completely in line with what she thinks of them. And why is the one decent man not fully Scottish? There was a point in the book that I was like, is she British? Like, is Ava Reid British? Because I've never heard an American person talk about Scottish people like this. This seems like a centuries old UK thing. Like, this seems like biases that have hundreds of years of war behind them. Not someone from America. Someone from America would not even know enough to have a Scottish bias. But I think she is American, so people surprise you every day. Oh yeah, and then about like 3/4 into the book, I remembered we got the like, what the fuck is it? No man born of woman can kill Macbeth prophecy. And as soon as I heard that, again, I was like, oh shit. She's gonna kill him because she's a woman, and that's how she's gonna beat the prophecy, is that she's not a man, and no man born of woman can kill Macbeth. And I do think that the woman being the answer to the prophecy makes a lot more sense than the C-section thing. And the C-section thing is weird, okay? So again, I think it makes perfect sense that like the answer to the prophecy is actually that a woman will kill Macbeth, which is probably why J.R.R. Tolkien did it 100 years ago. But it was just so predictable at this point. It's like as soon as I remembered that the prophecy existed, because at some point kind of got lost in the Macbeth, the Macbeth of it all got kind of lost on me. As soon as her boyfriend turned into a dragon, I was like, oh god, where are we? But once I remembered that the prophecy was happening, I was like, oh, it's definitely gonna be her. So it wasn't really shocking, but it wasn't a twist like when it happened, because immediately once I heard it again, immediately once I remembered what we were doing, I was like, oh, she's gonna kill him. And honestly, would have been. It got to the point like as I was reading up to that point, I was like, maybe her boyfriend will kill him, and that will be the prophecy, because he's actually like the drama of it all is that he was like, he's a beast, and so he's not a man born of woman, he's a beast, and like he's gonna kill Macbeth. Because actually at this point, like that would be more shocking than if she killed him. But no, she killed him. Again, like, it's fine. You don't have to shock me with the answer of a prophecy. It doesn't have to take me off guard. It's completely fine. It's okay. It's even, like, written in this way that she plans to kill. Like, it's her plan that he's gonna feel really secure because he thinks that no one can kill him, but actually he just hasn't considered that maybe a woman can kill him. And again, I think that's pretty good commentary. I think that's, like, a pretty good take on it. But it does come at the expense of a lot of things. In this book, I guess it's fine. I guess that's my like conclusion for this book, is just like, I guess, you know. I didn't hate it. I really didn't. I had a lot of criticisms for it, as you noticed. I think that it also just, a lot of the animosity that I was feeling towards this book comes also from just like the fatigue with feminist retellings in general that like aren't actually that feminist, and that are really just profiting off of the label of feminist as a marketing ploy rather than actually being dedicated to making anything feminist. This video is kind of messy, kind of rambly, but I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, honestly, if there are any other feminist retellings that you feel similarly about, that you feel differently about. I would love to hear like any of your opinions on this, whether you agree, disagree with me. We can talk about it. We're all adults here. We can have a conversation about it. Yeah, I'd like to know what you think, if you have felt anything similar, if you've read this book and didn't like it, liked it, whatever. I'd love to hear it. I have to get out of here. I've been talking for so long. I thought this video would be like 10 minutes. And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So, goodbye, love bugs, and I will see you in the next one.